control this for a little while. Just, you know,
Is it on? Live?
yeah, it's on.
Oh, it's playing right now?
Yeah, it's just gonna roll. Okay, we're gonna do something a little different for this group. Rather than go through the laborious kind of every one of these, we're going to have each of the students give a very short presentation about what their ideas were, just as an introduction. Just go down the line in order of the courses, and then we'll go from there. We'll open it up to general question, discussion, etc. Whatever interests us. Okay. Let me just first make a couple of introductory remarks about the project so that it doesn't get redundant about what we were trying to do. Okay, obviously this is a jazz studio, and there were two quotes that we started the studio with, and I'd like to read both of those quotes because I think those really underline the spirit of what we were trying to do in the studio. The first quote is by Piet Mondrian, and he says, "Remember, the painting comes first, then the theory." And then the second quote is by Joseph Albers, and it's a little more lengthy. It says, "We have presented a studio course, or if you prefer, a laboratory or workshop course, which opposes an administrative attitude of theory and practice. Naturally, practice is not preceded, but followed by theory. Such study promotes a more lasting teaching and learning through experience. Its aim is development of creativeness realized in discovery and invention, the criteria of creativity or flexibility being imagination and fantasy. Altogether, it promotes thinking in situations, a new educational concept unfortunately little known and less cultivated so far. After too much non-teaching, non-learning, and consequent non-seeing in too many art activities, it is time to advocate again a basic step-by-step learning which promotes recognition of insight coming from experience and evaluation resulting from comparison. This in sum means recognition of development and improvement, that is, of growth of ability. This growth is not only a most exciting experience, it is inspiring and thus the strongest incentive for intensified action, for continued investigation, search instead of research, for learning through conscious practice." Okay, let me just talk a little bit about the basic steps of the course, the methodology. In front of me I have one of the two-dimensional, we started from two-dimensional and worked in a sequence towards 3 dimensions. These pieces out here, we basically started with the song, and I think maybe we should first play the song, okay, and then we'll move on from there. I'll continue the explanation. This is Lester Leaps In by Lester Young and Count Basie's. Basie on piano, Buck Clayton on trumpet, Dickie Wells, I like these names, on trombone, Lester Young on tenor sax, Freddie Green on guitar, Walter Page, bass, Joe Jones, drums. Those of you who have, I don't know, there's something else on the back of this. One of the first things I gave them, well, the first step was, of course, to listen to the music, and they listened to it almost until they got sick of it. And this was a little arrangement chart of the choruses, the introduction, which is 4 bars, and then there are 6 choruses. The first chorus set up what you just heard, set up the basic theme of the music of the song, and the second, third, fourth, fifth, and sixth became different variations on that theme. The improvisation begins. So really, the second chorus is probably the mildest variation, and then as you get farther into the song, more manipulations, more interweaving of melodies and all that kind of stuff that jazz musicians do starts to happen. So what we basically did is we divided the class into chorus groups, 2nd through 6th. So nobody took the first, because the first became sort of the standard, the norm, which everybody had to listen to, and then they had to respond in their particular chorus. How was their chorus different from the first? So what you're looking at is one of many studies that they did. They started with more or less intuitive studies. I gave them a vocabulary of elements. I can't really remember exactly what the vocabulary was, but it was things like straight line, planes, L-shaped planes, U-shaped planes, arcs, things like that.
So you gave them vocabulary?
Yeah, I gave them the basic vocabulary, and then there were a set of rules that they had to address, certain size rules, all that kind of stuff.
But every one of them looks different.
Yeah, well, see, the basic vocabulary they took, they then diverged from that, see. I mean, it was a very basic vocabulary. In other words, I gave them a U shape, but then we said, okay, you can manipulate that U shape. You have 3 legs. You have, if you have the U, you can go this way, or it can start to become, one leg longer than the other. So that's where some of the variation and the interpretation started to happen.
Is it math time?
Yes. Now there's another element too, in that this chart. Let me just explain this chart. The basic structure of the song is what they call, it's a standard structure, what they call, standard A, A, B, A, and that refers to the melodies. You have an A melody, then a repeat of the A melody, then a B melody, which is like the bridge, or there's other names for that, the bridge, the transition melody, whatever you want to call it. I think bridge is the common term, and then return to the A. So A, B, A. And each of those sections are 8 measures. A measure consisted of, I think, 4 beats, or if it's halftime, it's 2 beats. I don't want to get too technical into all that. But as I don't know if you can see this from there, but the third chorus, for instance, took that 8-measure system and broke it down into 6 and 2, and what you get is a phenomenon called stop time, and that's where the beat, the underlying beat, the drummer stops for 6 measures, and then picks it back up for 2, stops for 6, 2, then he goes to he's back in time for 8, and stops for 6 and 2. So that's another subtle variation that particular chorus group picked up on. The fourth chorus had to do with what became known as a call and response kind of idea, where 4 bars of piano solo answered by 4 bars of the tenor sax, and that goes back and forth throughout this whole second chorus, still with the underlying theme of the A, B, A back there somewhere. And I don't know enough about music to really give you a technical analysis of that, but I mean, if you hear it enough times, you can start to recognize that, hey, yeah, there are certain references being made back to the beginning chorus. Then by the time you get to the fifth chorus, that structure is broken up into 3 and 5, where you have, if I can read backwards or upside down, ensemble, the whole group playing for 3, and then the tenor sax playing a solo for 5, then 3 again, 5 with the piano, and then the piano takes over for the B section, 3 and 5, and then the final chorus is kind of a reiteration of that 3-5 structure, and it finally culminates. It all comes together in really the last. It begins to come together in the next to the last section, 8 bars, and then the final section. So anyway, we had quite lengthy discussions on this while they were doing that. We talked about what did you observe, what kinds of things were occurring, and what started to develop in the project was a distinction between what we called the field elements, which are the gray in the background. And for instance, this is an example of one student's interpretation of the second chorus. Okay, and they had to conform to whatever the structure of the chorus is. So, for instance, you can see here this represents an 8-bar B section. This is an 8-bar A section, and then because of his interpretation of the music, he felt that these two first A sections kind of worked together, and he used the elements, or what became known as the figures, to bridge across that. Now I don't know, maybe I'm taking the thunder away from you, but I'm just using this as an underlying assumption for everybody. And there's also very faintly underneath here is what we call the beat bar, which was, sort of our measuring system, which.
So basically, what you've done is you've taken the music and analyzed the structure of the music and put that into a graphic representation, as opposed to doing the notes you did in graphic terms.
Yeah, and see the interpretive, perhaps the improvisational aspect of it comes in how they manipulate the figures and how they use the figures to kind of, in their own mind, represent what's happening to a certain extent in the music. And we didn't want to take it too literal, note by note, that kind of thing.
They didn't have the benefit of
Yeah, we don't have any sheet music because nothing was ever written. I mean, this was.
So you basically did the same thing as the Bach studio did, except you did it by listening, we did it by
looking at
the notes.
Right. One aside too about Lester Leaps In, which is very interesting, is that performance that you heard, we had 2 takes that we listened to, and they're quite different. I mean, they're both the same song. The original take and then the outtake, the take that they didn't use, and discovered certain differences in the improvisation. One of the most interesting things, and this is a very crucial thing about jazz too, is the spontaneity. These were one-off performances. These guys got together. They decided, hey, we're going to jam today. They recorded 3 or 4 songs that afternoon, and that was it. I mean, they basically knew what the structure was, and they had sort of an agreement of that, the Count Basie, of course, and they just got up and played. And this performance is considered by jazz aficionados and other experts as being a classic performance, and it's, it was never written. It's not a written piece of music. It's a spontaneous performance that happened to be recorded.
But it's probably a chart, but it's just
Yeah,
changed.
this is, basic idea.
So it's highly structured, but it's also spontaneous at the same time.
Well,
Yeah.
the individual, the head is probably written out. That's all written out, but the individual organizations.
Are completely out of line.
Yeah.
And that's proven by the 2 outtakes, and that they're different. Lester does something, I mean, it's the same song, but he does little different
The
responses.
arrangement's probably written too, which is
Yeah.
what you have there.
Right.
The 3/5, the 4/4 trades.
Yeah,
That's established too.
yeah. Yeah, I mean, they came to the session with agreement that they had this, and then they went from there. So that's basically, the takeoff point. They responded to this. They did several studies. They did line drawings, all that stuff. Then, do you have your model for this one? Oh, you didn't bring that? When we did, just as an example. This was a second of two models. We don't have the other one because they're kind of beat up. But then they went through an analysis of what they did, sort of quasi-spatially, because this was seen as, two-dimensional, etc. And I wanted to get them to start thinking in 3 dimensions. So we came up with this model of a series of planes, of clear planes. And it was up to the students then to sort of dissect what they did. At the same time, they were rearranging things to a certain extent and recomposing things, things that didn't work out or they were dissatisfied with, in the original proposal. And started to look at these things, as I say, quasi-spatially, and and it was a flexible model so that they could move the planes around and start to look at this from not necessarily an elevational point of view, but more of trying to see what kind of responses they got as they looked at these planes that were exploded out of or decomposed out of this thing. Then after dealing with that for, I don't know, maybe a week or a week and a half of messing around with that, then they were asked to now take this and propose 3-dimensional forms and also propose thickening of the gray elements and starting to really get into more of a 3-dimensional structure that was originally conceived from this point of view, but also could be looked at from this point of view. And we had Marvin come in for that jury, and we talked about how this could potentially be a building, just with not too much fooling around. You could start to propose an actual structure, and what kind of wild sections you were getting out of this. And the interesting thing about this,
What happens when you turn it?
huh?
Something wonderful happens when you turn it down like that.
No,
From there,
yeah.
pull it down.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a
So
little
a whole
different.
transformation takes place, which is pretty exciting.
Now, some of the things too that were discussed, and this was discussed by us during a number of sessions, and some people thought about it, some people didn't at certain points, and I think it really came to fruition, I guess, was when we had a short jury with Peter Eisenman, and he started to say that they hadn't gone far enough, and I'm not sure if this is going to come apart, is it? If I break it, you can hit me or something. Maybe you should do it. You know how tough I am on models. I don't know if this is the best example of this, but starting to see that, okay, look at it both this way and this way, and maybe simultaneously together, somehow these things start to interpenetrate through, because one of the criticisms that was leveled at some of the students was the fact that really, when you looked at a lot of these, they were really only dealing with the X and the Y dimension. And the Z, or the depth, really was just, kind of a dumb extrusion.
Can you tell us what obviously the X is time, Y is pitch, Z is what?
Personality.
Well, I'm talking more in architectural terms than in
Well, I mean, what
intensity.
Okay. The 2 dimensional. Sorry to interrupt.
No, that's okay.
But you mark things along here. That's time.
Yeah.
That's X. The
Y.
vertical figure is the Y.
Right.
Vertical.
And the Z moves.
Well, the Y is it begins to read as there's the rhythm section, chunk, 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 down here, and then somebody's over the top. That's again very much like charts, sheet music,
Linear.
linear.
Yeah.
Tell me a little bit
didn't really think of it that way because, see, one of the other things too about the studio, and you know, it's kind of a confession, is that none of us really knew what we were doing. Okay.
That's fine.
You know, I mean, this was an exploration that I was involved with as much as they were to a certain extent. You know, I was kind of the instigator of this thing, and you know, it was up to them to kind of take off, and I was sort of the, you know, the behind-the-scenes cheerleader. And really, a lot of this stuff just was not planned. I mean, you know, when I started the studio, this model was not, you know, I had no idea we were going to do this kind of model. Neither did they.
See, this is X, Y. This could be X, this could be X, this Y, because it's a plane. Z is variety of points.
Well, you're talking about it in an architectural terms.
I mean, in a
Yeah.
geometry, so
Yeah.
that's what X, Y, Z, and that's what it is.
See, we,
Professor Neiman?
yeah.
I think the answer is that by the time we got to the point where we were dealing with the Z-axis, we had left the music behind and we're dealing only with the vocabulary that we had established.
Right.
We're no longer concerned with actually
Well,
responding to the music anymore.
it's possible, I don't mean to interrupt you, movie,
No, go ahead. I
to
mean, this
conceive
is
of music as a spatial, three-dimensional. Yeah, I hear it that way.
especially if you have a good stereo.
Well, no, I mean, that has to do with left to right, and that's
Yeah.
physical positioning of musicians, but there is time, there is pitch, there's maybe.
But there's a lot of other dimensions. It could be a five-dimensional
Yeah.
space.
Yeah.
It is, but it is spatial, and it has to do with presence, it has to do with foreground and background. Melody, maybe that has something to do with that. It has to do with, what else we call it spatial?
Well, I mean, people talk about depth of music. Or speakers, you know, they have depth. Is there flat sound?
Yeah.
Is it decibels? Or I
Is it
don't
loud?
know.
That's just
No.
that's just
It's the range of frequencies that you hear.
But that's this way.
Yeah,
That's
it's,
the vertical.
yeah.
I mean, that could read a, you know, you could read an orchestra chart with, you know, all the top parts.
Yeah, but it's more that it's the overtones and everything. When you talk about like depth, or if it's a flat sound.
But Paul, if you hear a music, you said you see it three-dimensionally, you hear it three-dimensionally?
Yeah.
Do you see it three-dimensionally?
Yes.
Do you see volumes and the space? Or do you bring, that's your
It's
mind?
It's something moving behind something. Maybe that's this Z dimension. Something moving
In all
behind-
directions?
You know, I guess that maybe the depth is what attracts the attention, but that's a much more elusive sort of dimension. Maybe that's where we get into this whole cubist issue of what's in front of the other.
yeah, the
So it's that
ambiguities
notion
of
of
those
ambiguity.
things.
Yeah, it's that notion of
Like
ambiguity.
with the Bach, the two voices, which one comes forward, which one goes back.
Yeah, okay, so maybe the Z direction has to do with melody and Z.
Okay, well,
Well, yeah, no,
anyway,
I'm just trying to
see,
get this,
Yeah.
okay. But when you flip it 90 degrees, all of a
Yeah.
sudden you look at it.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. It's strange.
Okay, now somewhere in between this exploration.
What are these little pieces? These are,
Well, see, these are the reinterpretation of I don't know where it is. This
Some-
thing's
some
way
things-
down over there.
It's right there.
I'm looking at
Right there in the middle. It's the fourth down.
Oh, there.
some things
Yeah.
move deeper than others.
Yeah. See, and again, we established, you know, I gave them a certain set of rules, and we found out that some of my rules weren't working too well. So then we said, well, okay, if you don't like my rules, make up your own rules, you know, for crying out loud. And you know, there were certain rules for, you know, how far back you go. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think initially, I think one of the standard rules was that each of these planes were seen as transparent. They were only there to help hold the model together. And so you would go back as far as you could until you hit something, okay? And then you also go forward. And I think some people use the forward-backward rule. Some people had some, you know, I don't know. There were, everybody had their own sort of thing at this point.
And another possible reading of the depth is that there are certain
Put this
tonal things, for example, a C major 6, C, E, G, A, is the same notes as an A minor 7. So the same notes have multiple readings depending on
On the same chord could be different inversion, depending on placement.
Right, so yeah, okay, so there is an ambiguity depending on,
Well, one thing to understand is that we did not get into any kind of technical
music theory.
music theory because I'm not,
But
you
you
know,
hear
I'm
it.
obviously not
But
an
you hear
expert.
it, but you
And it
hear it.
shows.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Okay, you know, after we went through this process, then we had the stage of which I think, you know, I see little stages in some of the final projects. That was probably the most, at least in my mind, and I think the students' mind, the most frustrating project in a lot of ways. You may think that this was very frustrating, but because now they had to sort of take this vocabulary and begin to make architecture out of it. And what happened is that they got, you know, they started to get hung up on, you know, functional issues, you know, how do I get up there, you know, all this kind of other stuff. And it tended to sort of tighten things up a little bit and get people a little nervous at this point. And so, you know, at a certain point, you know, we went through that, we had to go through that. And then, of course, Mr. Eisenman came to the, you know, sort of the rescue, or maybe in some people's mind, to the detriment. I'm not really sure at this
You
point.
guys don't know what you have.
Yeah, we don't know what the hell we're doing. And so, you know, then we had, you know, we were in the midst of working on the actual institute. And he really, you know, again, made it apparent that if you're going to go through this exercise, you really have to have some kind of continuity between what you guys did before and what you're going to do at the end. And, you know, if this thing becomes the greatest hit of the semester, you've basically failed. And maybe that's what happened. You know, I don't know. And so these are the institutes in their...
On the same site.
Yeah, on the same site. Now, there's a little story about the site. We sort of took a little bit of liberty with the site. First of all, we never visited the site. We took advantage of our other classmates, and we were very pleased that you guys took the pictures for us and made the site models for us. We got a lot of use out of those, and we thank you very kindly for putting the effort in on those things. And so we, you know, came up with a somewhat, I mean, you know, the assumption was that, okay, we had a site plan that was at, I don't know, what was it, 1/1000th scale or some crazy thing like that.
1 to 187 or
Yeah,
something?
and I mean, it wasn't exactly, you know, a site survey of any degree of accuracy. And so, you know, and then you find out that the contours are 40 feet apiece. So, you know, you kind of look at a piece of land and you say, well, that's sort of flat, I guess. And we picked that part out as being our site. And really what they had to then develop as they went through the process is kind of propose their own sculpting of the site, which is really what we call the base, okay? And it was up to them to kind of, you know, somehow determine what they thought how the land would step up and down. And I think at this point, now that, you know, I've made sort of this lengthy introduction, I think it's now time for each of the people to give a...
Well,
yeah.
Does the land necessarily move at models, or does it move at maybe some mid-level armor?
Yeah, see, they were given a volume of, well, the site, the piece of land that they were given is, let's see, it's 120 feet wide by 240 feet long, and then they had a height limitation of 120 feet. Now that 120 feet could be interpreted, if they wanted to have elements that protruded into the ground 60 feet, yeah, that was up to them. I mean, You know, so the assumption is you know, some of the bases are more lower to the ground, where others imply that there's going to be higher ground at the other end.
But
And really, I'll let them explain that.
But in certain ways, the relationship of the building or the sculpture, whatever, towards the environment there builds off what was given.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and then there was also some discussion too about the way the site was oriented. One side was generally the mountains, the other side was the city. And really it was up to them to address whether or not they wanted to deal with that issue or if that was important. I mean, really, you know, this studio was really focusing in on perhaps a smaller set of issues. And with an attempt of trying to do you know, certain set of formal issues well, and frankly, we basically ignored certain issues. But I don't think in the long run, they're really ignored, so.
No,
You
it's an
you
alternative.
used, I certainly disagree with that. I think, in my opinion, it's not the smaller issues. But didn't you say that they didn't deal with the smaller issue, or they did the major issue? What did you say?
No, what I'm saying is that there were certain issues that we left out, like, for instance, really contextual issues.
They weren't left out, they were just assumed given.
Yeah, they were given, or they were de-emphasized, so to speak. They weren't top of the list. I mean, if they were, we would have gone out and visited the site and done, you know, what the other sections did. Okay, I think, you know, we can sort of get into the discussion, because, you know, I want to give enough time. Yeah, I want to, you know, give the students enough
Doesn't
time.
work.
What we'll do is, you know, why don't you just, you know, I think the easiest thing would be to sort of stand by your model, or maybe you should just bring it out there for a
Yeah,
couple
why not?
minutes.
It's an old country western.
Yeah.
Stand by it.
Stand by your model, okay.
Stand by your
Oh,
dog.
this
Yeah, why
is
don't you
Jack.
put that down?
Stand by your man.
No, it's stand by your dog.
Stand by your horse. Your what? Stand by your dog.
Now, we're going to go through each of them, you know, we're not going to really stop for any discussion until we go through all 5 of them, or all 11 of them, as quickly as we can. You've got like a couple minutes, okay?
So we don't ask any questions?
No, let's wait until, you know,
How many minutes he had? 1?
I'm Roger Ewell,
something like
and
that.
the Jazz Institute, in my design, is based on an underlying rhythm, the flow of the music and the piano staccatos. And of course, the fields in the background there then became planes on which I established the bass from the rhythm using the U-shapes and the circular shapes as columns and projecting those upward. Then to take those basic forms and to define those in plan to create reusable spaces. And this is dining kitchen facility. These are classrooms and studios. And this is the director's house, and this is the outdoor stage. These are guest apartments. This is the indoor performance, the theory classroom, and the library. So my attempt was to then use those forms that I had improvised by listening to the music and to make architectural elements of it.
This is almost an autonomous process if you'd happened all by itself.
Based on music. It seems to have occurred that way, but it didn't really.
Okay, that's good. Okay, next. This is sort of the overview, the introduction.
Wonderful. This is the library. Okay.
Yeah, no, you can just leave that down there. I mean, I think.
How many square feet is this?
How many square feet do you want?
1/8 scale.
If
That's
anybody
1/8
asks
scale.
this question, just throw a
Is
figure.
that really?
That's 1/8 scale.
Yeah, be positive.
50,000.
Say 24,500 square feet. She wouldn't know it.
Why don't you, Why don't we let him
Once you go to your
explain?
client and say that this is it, he's not gonna.
Right. I'm Anusha, and I took the main idea from the composition of the three-dimensional model and give it to the side and use the main composition of replication of the music to the side of, and put some program in it and use the different plan and some element on the three-dimensional. That's the dormitory, the main building. They have a parking underneath it and have a the spiral stairs around the elevator that go through there.
Do all of
Each-
these go stairs?
No.
That's one. Took him 8 hours to do that.
And that,
Well, that's beautiful.
and the dormitory is on the top of the second level, and the practice, dual practice and ensemble practice is underneath the floor.
Now, what are these?
So this will be the top floor of the cafeteria that you can relax on the top.
I was hoping that each of these would be like a music station.
That would be like a,
For one musician each that would be hooked up to earphones, and then each of them,
Wait, yeah, I'm
and
free.
each of them would be only tuned in to one of the other players, and then there'd be a guy below recording all of it.
Well, that's the way the studios work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They, you know, it used to be that you get 10 guys in
They're
a
all in
room and
separate
they all listen to
booths.
each other. Now they're all in separate booths and they all listen to a click track. And you know, they could be half of them on the West Coast, half of them on the East Coast. You know, they're just kind of wired together.
Okay.
That's interesting.
That's nice.
that's in B section it should be like a office and facility.
What's that?
The B section.
B
like
section.
A classroom and everything.
Mr. Messinger is sort of the black sheep here because he decided
Changed
to.
all the rules.
Yeah, he immediately questioned the rules by using his fields black and white. But I'll let you.
Well, you know what that looks like, is you were too inspired by the Macintosh. You hit one of the buttons that like changed everything.
Actually, this is before we ever got into that. Well, I had the stop time one, which is when the saxophone and piano play for 6 measures and the ensemble is silent, and then for 2 measures the ensemble plays. So I thought the ultimate contrast between silence and sound is black and white, so that's why I changed the colors of the fields to black and white. And sort of part of the theme that I started working on is sort of like the duality relationship in music. Music is a linear thing and has a starting point and an ending point. But in this song, it sort of repeats itself something like 6 times with the 6 different measures. So that's why I've got the cut circles in there. Plus the linear element goes all the way through, which you can see here in the bridge and stuff. Because it's sort of, whoops.
That bridge is not literal though.
Yeah, it's linear.
I mean, but it's a literal translation of bridge in music.
Oh, no.
Okay.
No, it's simply to tie the whole thing together. And it's a linear thing, and yet it's a circular thing. And it sort of comes around on itself, but it never actually comes back as a circle. It sort of falls over itself. Continues that way.
What are the smokestacks?
Those are these little dots right here.
Yeah, I know that, but what are they? Do you-
Wow,
do you
this
know?
one's an elevator, this one's a staircase. It's really, it's
It's
just
vertical transport, or vertical.
Yeah, vertical circulation. Of course, this would just be empty sort of.
Well, what in the horizontal plan here, the stacks are these little bumps comes in. What are those? Those are.
That's actually what it is Bass's piano. At the end of each 2-measure thing in the ensemble plays, he goes boom on the piano, and that's what that is.
What's this storage space?
That's
That's the janitor's closet.
Yeah, that's the outdoor stage that.
That's the stage for the other project.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Is it at the same scale?
Yes, it is. It's more detailed because it was,
This is a mega structure.
yeah.
So
Very much
so Basie
amazing.
actually was that on 1 or 4?
Which,
What's that?
The 10-finger chords.
oh,
That was on 1 or 4.
I think he did that on 4. Yeah,
Are they all the same?
the fourth beat.
Yeah. Well, it's just.
No, they weren't always the same
It's
chord.
not
Why are
necessarily
they
on the beat.
always the same?
Like,
You know,
Are you gonna organize this, you gonna lay this out on the floor and then we could walk along with it?
Yeah, maybe,
Okay.
maybe we'll do it.
Looks organized.
should I just go into this?
Look, yeah, you're taking more time, okay, so.
Okay, well, you know,
You got anything else you need to say?
well, no, I assume we're gonna.
Okay.
Well, no, no.
Just keep it moving.
this is smaller than this. As far as this.
This one comes as first.
You like that?
Had the same,
Once somebody's grabbed this one.
So how do bathrooms work?
Very well, it all flushes downhill. Again, I treated the 6'2", 6'3".
All right.
I get that response.
The white being bridge section, so we were restricted to using 2 shades of gray plus, so we can use the white or black, which is unlikely to.
Where's the bridge in this one?
What's this little sinusoidal?
Yeah.
Well, in the music, when he runs through that bridge section, there's a running up, down, running up and down. It's very sinusoidal music at that point, and it varies slightly from the A sections, I thought, at least to my ear.
But it's not in there.
No, I didn't carry it. We didn't have to carry the elements all the way to the end. It was just developing elements, given the dimensions and whatnot, and then further employing them as need arised.
Yeah, they had the option of rejecting certain elements that just didn't work
Did they have the
architecturally.
option of taking those
These
planes
sections,
and flipping them?
Yeah, they're all 8.
8-inch scale.
You could flip them
1/8
at 90 degrees to each
scale.
other.
No, you're talking about 8 bars.
8 bars,
Oh, I'm
8
sorry.
bars in B section?
Yeah.
But also knowing that this is 1/8-inch scale, right?
This is 1/8 scale.
Yep.
I'd love to see a little model of a person.
Well, this is
Just for
10
amusement.
feet.
So actually, this is a floor.
Yeah.
So that's big.
It's 8-inch scale. There's 9, there's 10 feet, 12 feet here,
It was 10 feet there.
10 feet there, which might be a little bit narrow for a structure. But
Is there anything else that you need to talk about at this point, Jim?
Oh, not at this point. I just tried to maintaining the two-directional situation with my fields here, where certainly maintaining here, took them literally from the plexiglass and then tried to take them up in the vertical direction, and then try to hang my a lot of my elements.
I'm gonna ask a totally irrelevant question. Is this sitting on a flat area in the site, or does the land somehow come up to certain levels of it?
The land, north is that way, so west, east. We're at the highest point of the site here, so it would be slightly below the base. And it would slope off down in that direction, supposedly 40 feet lower
So it would basically
down
be
here
sticking up out of the site.
Indeed, you could turn the whole thing upside down.
Parts of it would
Same
be.
difference.
This would be just slightly higher than the site.
so if I look at the
Site would
side
be
of the building,
sloping.
I see a line in here, this goes like.
Right, those things would be sticking up.
Why don't you flatten the site?
Yeah, that'd be
Just flatten the site.
It just takes a bulldozer about 2 days, y'all flatten.
But it wrecks it.
You could sharp the side too.
I mean, why?
The one porch of the land.
Okay, let's move on to this one.
See, you can turn this whole thing upside down, it doesn't even matter. I mean, because it's almost left to right, top to bottom, or this way.
It's Mr. Laux. What do you think?
I had the fourth chorus, which was a call and response chorus, alternating 4 bars of solo work between the piano and the saxophone. And upon listening to it, I kind of was struck that they were working from themes set out earlier in the piece, and they stuck pretty close to those as their hooks, and then they gradually broke away from them and started improvising more and expanding upon that. So what I tried to do was set up their initial hooks each with the 2 instruments, and this kind of connection business gives way then to a more furious curvilinear thing that represented how they're getting away from the original structure, and which is what I tried to represent with the ground planes, with the descension of the original hooks, and then the building towards the end of the piece. What else do you want to say?
No,
You got anything else to say?
I can't make any comments, but that's.
Yeah, we're just,
Yeah.
yeah, I just want to like get, so you get an overview of what everybody's doing.
These models speak for themselves, so.
What's
Okay.
this centerpiece?
This here?
That's the
This was our
stage.
stage.
And each musician is in the various levels.
It doesn't need, the way we approach the stage, we could have it as a soloist performing for himself or another group of people, whoever wants to meander on it and decide to play.
Do people have to be in this, or can it all be just sort of a sculpture with piped in music and musicians performing opposite places?
Do you mean the stage or the entire site?
The entire site. Do people have to be there?
No. I mean, from the approach, which I no, not really. I mean, it was designed with people in mind at this point, yes, but I would say no, it's not a requirement for this to exist.
Okay, let's go on to the next one. Is this thing working?
Yeah, wait a second.
Oh,
All right, now it's set.
okay.
Watch your face. You're not supposed to stand right in front of it.
Let's turn it around.
Oh, man.
What?
Now it's really...
Is it going?
Yeah, it's going.
I had the same chorus as Paul, and that might be evident by the 8 rhythm going underneath. And there was a couple things I was trying to do. I used the underlying rhythm to set the site. And my basic idea is the ground would meet it. Another thing I tried to do is establish a real strong set of rules for how colors get used. The grays in the side are only used to delineate height, whereas this is a B section, so it gets the darkest color. White planes are only used for vertical. Black interior objects become black, and I had a fairly strong set of rules which I used. There's a definite hierarchy where the outdoor stage is the highest part, and most important, the only thing allowed to be higher is the director's observation tower. I felt the director should have a chance to look over the site. The other thing that I noticed very strongly in the call and response format is how they don't quite stick to their measure. They spill over into the next measure, which I tried to indicate here with the straddling of elements on the divisions. So I did that here by allowing my elements to shift levels as they went across the site. Other than that, it's the basic interpretation of that 4th chorus.
What are these things? These 2
These
vertical
planes?
No.
These guys?
Yeah.
This one would be mostly, these might necessarily not be voids, it might be glassed in, but the idea for this would be the basic learning center, it would be the school itself, the recital halls, classrooms. This is the student dormitories, guest housing, director's house, practice studios, library, offices. I've actually.
It's the other way around.
Yeah.
Here and
Underneath the B section is the indoor performance area.
I think it's remarkable that you can assign functions to all of this.
Yeah.
And, you could say, well, would you believe the dormitories are here? No.
Another thing I've tried to do, which I did in here, is try and keep my dimensions all within realms. And here they all follow this thickness here and variations of that. And I did the same thing here. These are all variations of this division.
Some of them make sense, because if you take a scale, and very well could be a dormitory, but I don't know why.
I did try to follow scale. That's the director's studio and the director's house. That's where he would actually live.
I'd also like to add that this is the heaviest model.
It's solid wood all the way through.
How much wood is in there?
A lot. It's absolutely solid wood. I figured that you get your grade by your
Did you
model
get that
weights.
thick wood?
No, I thought
It's
it was
many
the opposite.
laminated pieces of
Or is it one
plywood.
piece of wood It's a card.
It's many pieces of layers of wood that have been cut and glued, and hours of loving labor.
Okay, okay.
I need help with this.
Yeah, this is the hernia model. Yeah.
Okay. As everyone else, I basically took my forms and planes into my model. But when I was looking for a way to organize these, I found inspiration from how the environment is set up. You have the two things speaking to each other, the city on one, the mountains on the other. And I found that within the Institute, we have some things speaking to each other. There's the participants, students, and teachers. So I set them across an axis in the site this way. And then there's also, within the education, there's theory and practice, two levels of education. And I set that along, split that along an axis this way.
Can you tip the model up so we can do that?
Something new, yeah. But all the contours come basically right from the planes in this, and most of the forms come directly from it as well.
So you're saying these things do
Well, no, these do. So I have these being the library and the lecture, the theory part of the education, and then these are the practice studio, isolated from each other, and there weren't many social areas. So my program that I finally came around to was basically you come to this institute for a short period of time to completely develop yourself in the study of jazz. There's not a lot of socialization other than playing jazz music.
Don't be bashful about
You
it.
have your little outpost in the tree, and you go there and practice, and then you meet others in the practice areas, and you're there to do jazz.
Okay.
First in the